Today we will be talking about the one-way Anova test and how to complete it in SPSS. So for one-way Anova, you need an independent variable that is nominal that has more than two unrelated groups and a dependent variable that is either ratio or interval. And the data set that I'm using is from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey from the Guilford County 2011 High School Surveys. So to start our analysis, we're going to go to Analyze, and again we're comparing means, so you go to Compare Means and One-Way Anova. And the questions that we need for our research question is question 91 and question 96, and our research question is, are there differences among different racial groups, white, African American, Asian, and other, and the amount of hours of sleep they get on an average school night? So the dependent list you can think of as your dependent variable or your ratio or interval data, and your factor you can think of the nominal variable that has the unrelated groups. So we're going to change this to variable names since we know our questions, and we're going to scroll down, and 91 is our question that is related to the amount of hours of sleep they get on an average school night, so we're going to move it to dependent list. And the race category is our nominal data that has the four unrelated groups, so it gets moved to the factor. Next, we're going to select options, and we want to make sure that we have descriptive and homogeneity of variance tests selected, and you hit continue. Then before we leave, you want to go to the post hoc and make sure it doesn't matter which one you choose, but you need one from equal variance assumed and the test from equal variance not assumed. So for our analysis, we're going to select 2K and we're going to select 10 hands. And you hit continue. Then we hit OK to get our data pulled up into output. So up here are your different racial groups and their means and other information. And again, we want to know, is there an overall difference? And if so, what are the differences within the groups? So we're going to start at one way. We're going to start at the Anova box, and we're going to look at our p-value. And our p-value is 0.014, and that is less than 0.05. So this lets us know that there is an overall difference. So we have to keep going to find out the differences between the groups since we have more than two groups here. So now we're going to look at the p-value in the Levine's box, and it is 0.001, and that's smaller than 0.05, so that lets us know if we're going to use 2K or 10 Haynes. So since the p-value is smaller than 0.05, equal variance is not assumed, so we're going to use the bottom box, which is 10 Haynes. And I'm going to scroll down to show you, these are your post hoc tests, so we're going to use this lower section of the comparison chart. So we have 4 groups overall, which means ultimately we're going to make 6 comparisons. And to make these comparisons, let's start off with the whites versus African American. You're going to look at your p-value, which is 0.210, and you can also look at your 95% confidence interval values. So this is larger than 0.05, so this lets us know that there is no differences on the amount of sleep that whites and African Americans get on an average school night. And there's also a 0 that is present between the 95% confidence interval, and that also lets you know that since there's a 0 there, there's a possibility that there's no difference. So that just confirms what we got with our p-value. Now comparing whites and Asians, our p-value is 0.25. Here it is, 0.25. So that's smaller than 0.05, and our confidence interval does not contain a 0, so that lets us know that this is statistically significant and that there is a difference between whites and Asians. So we want to know which group receives more sleep. So we go back to the top and you compare the means. The means for whites was 4.17 and the means for Asians is 3.25. 3.80. So this lets us know that there is a difference, and since the whites have a larger average, we can conclude that they receive more hours of sleep than their Asian counterparts. So far we've done 2 comparisons, so we have 4 left to go. So now let's look at whites and others. So make sure you're in the right box. We're going to scroll down to Tim Haynes. Whites and others. So the p-value for whites and others is 0.707. And here you can see that there is a 0 between the 95% confidence interval. So we know that this data is not statistically significant and that there is an overall difference, but that there is not an overall difference, between whites and others. So next we move to African Americans and Asians. We've already compared them to whites, so we can skip to the next one, to Asians. And here you can see that the p-value is 0.379 and the confidence interval does indeed contain a 0. So this lets us know that the data is not statistically significant. There's no differences between African Americans and Asians in the amount of sleep they receive on an average night. So now we're going to compare African Americans and others. This is the p-value, 1.000, and this is the confidence interval, and you can see that a 0 is present in this confidence interval. So again, there's no statistically significant data. There's no differences between the amount of sleep for African Americans and others. So now we move to our Asians group. So we've already compared Asians with whites and Asians with African Americans. So now we compare Asians with others. And here the p-value is 0.372. And you can see that there is a 0 between the 95% confidence interval, which is negative 0.63 and 0.12. So this lets us know that the data is not statistically significant and that there is not an overall difference between Asian and others. So what does all of this mean? Well, we only identified one group that was statistically significant, and that was whites and Asians. And we identified that the whites had a larger average than Asians. So this means that the data there is a difference, and the difference lies within this group of whites and Asians, and that whites on average gets more sleep on an average school night than their Asian counterparts. And this is a one-way Anova. Thank you.